Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a hushed marble lobby in 1964, where fluorescent lights hum softly and your polished shoes echo off the tiles. You're at IBM headquarters, back when IBM was less cloud computing and more. We have machines the size of small kitchens. The air smells faintly like ink ribbons and ambition. And there, at the far end of the lobby, behind a velvet rope and a plaque written in overly hopeful sans serif font, stands the clock. Except it's not just a clock. It's a room-sized, gear-churning, wire-snaking monstrosity that doesn't tell you the time, tells you what time will become. The future forecasting computerized time display, or as one janitor affectionately called it, the big ticker, was IBM's bold stab at techno-prophecy. Built during the space age, designed with the optimism of a Jetsons episode, this machine claimed to project the world's path all the way to the 21st century. You probably won't believe this, but at one point, the clock actually claimed there would be a colony on Mars by 1997, and people would get married through vending machines by 2004. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you are right now. I want to know which time zone is dozing off first. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle closer to the glass. The clock doesn't tick. Its lights flicker in organized patterns like a low-budget Christmas display with a PhD. Cables snake along the floor like lazy pythons, feeding into a console that looks part computer, part carnival attraction. The numbers roll slowly, not showing hours or minutes, but abstract concepts. Global GDP, civil unrest index, solar activity probability. It's not showing time, it's showing fate, dressed up in blinking bulbs. The year is 1964, and IBM is already bored with the present. Engineers in white short-sleeve shirts and skinny ties stroll by the clock like it's totally normal to check a mechanical oracle before lunch. There's a chart taped to one side labeled 1964 prediction accuracy, 84.6%, though how they calculated that no one quite knows. One programmer, Harold maybe, with a severe crew cut, types commands into a teletype terminal while sipping a tab cola. You wonder what he's asking. Will we win the space race? Will disco destroy democracy? Will my boss ever pronounce my name right? And then it happens. A soft, mechanical hum followed by a wheeze like a tired fax machine. The clock spits out a narrow ribbon of paper, dot matrix font, all uppercase, smelling faintly of ozone and nervous sweat. You squint. It says, projected outcome, 1981, self-cleaning office buildings, moderate political instability, New York Giants wins Super Bowl. You look up. Harold gives a shrug like, hey, 2 out of 3. What's wild is that this wasn't some goofy side project. IBM put real resources behind this. They wanted the clock in every major office by 1970. They envisioned CEOs making decisions not from quarterly reports, but from giant mechanical future readings like corporate astrology, except with more punch cards and fewer gemstones. And the public, they ate it up. Newspapers ran headlines like IBM clock sees flying cars by 85 and business by the numbers, tomorrow's numbers. There was even a short film shown in schools where a kid asks the clock, will I become an astronaut? And the machine answers, likely if study habits improve. You can't help but smile. It's adorable and slightly terrifying at the same time, like a puppy with a flamethrower. Now here's the first mainstream fact to store away for trivia night. IBM's forecasting technologies in the 1960s weren't limited to this one wacky clock. They were pioneers in what we now call predictive analytics, using early computers to crunch data for everything from crop yields to Cold War probabilities. But here's the fringe tidbit. Some IBM staff nicknamed the clock Nostradamus, after it incorrectly forecast that Canada would enter a brief civil war in 1972 over metric system adoption. Not exactly a high point for machine-led diplomacy. Still, you admire the ambition. IBM didn't just want to build machines that worked. They wanted machines that knew, machines that weren't just fast or efficient, but wise. That line of thought honestly feels kind of cozy now, like they believed the future was knowable, orderly, programmable. If you just fed in enough punch cards, maybe you could understand the chaos. Maybe you could prepare. You sit down on a nearby bench. The upholstery is itchy. A fly buzzes lazily overhead. Somewhere an IBM employee yells, "That's not how you load a card reader," and you hear the clatter of punched paper. But here, in front of the clock, it's calm. The lights pulse slowly, like a sleeping heartbeat. It's as if the machine is whispering, "Relax. I've seen what's coming, and it's manageable." You close your eyes. For a second, you believe it. You're still seated in that scratchy, upholstered bench, staring at the clock's blinking array of lights, when you start to notice something peculiar. Everything in this building revolves around time. Not just in the corporate is obsessed with punctuality kind of way. No, IBM isn't just on the clock. IBM is the clock. You rise and start wandering through the building, passing open-door offices where engineers are arguing not about salaries or sales targets, but about synchronization protocols and time drift tolerances. One whiteboard simply reads, "Clock cycle stability equals sign reputation." At IBM, time is religion, and the HQ, it's a cathedral to it. You step into a hallway lined with showcases, not of products, but of timekeeping devices. Pocket watches used by early IBM inspectors. A massive brass marine chronometer from the 1930s. The first IBM time clock, circa 1911, looking like a wooden bread box with a bad attitude. One placard reads, "The machine that launched 100,000 punch cards." Another, "All hail the master clock of Endicott, 1923. It's almost funny. This is a company built on selling time. Literally. IBM's ancestor company, the Computing Tabulating Recording Company, CTR, made time recorders, machines that tracked employee hours. That's what their business was before they ever touched a transistor. It wasn't until the 1920s that they started pivoting toward information processing. But those roots, still deeply embedded. Every hallway, every product name, every staff meeting schedule bears the marks of temporal obsession. You pass a conference room called Zulu Sync and another called Latency Lab. Even the cafeteria clock runs on a synced atomic time signal. No more excuses, one engineer jokes as he munches a tragically dry ham sandwich. Now, here's the mainstream historical tidbit. IBM was one of the first major corporations to incorporate atomic time synchronization into their data systems. As early as the late 1950s, they were experimenting with using time as a unifying language for their machines, synchronizing systems that were continents apart. But let's talk about the weird stuff. In the basement, you find an abandoned hallway nicknamed the Clock Corridor. The lights flicker like they're auditioning for a horror film. Rumor has it, this was where IBM kept a prototype of a biometric time clock, one that not only logged your arrival time, but also tracked your body temperature and stress levels. It was supposedly shelved after it started issuing mandatory mental wellness breaks for high-performing execs, because nothing says promotion like a machine telling you to cry more. Back upstairs, you pass an open lab filled with stacks of magnetic tape reels. A handwritten sign reads, "Project Echo Time, do not erase." Inside, two engineers are fine-tuning a simulation that tries to align global business trends with planetary orbits. One of them looks up, shrugs, and says, "You never know, Mercury retrograde might tank the Nasdaq." And you start to get it. To IBM, time isn't just a measurement, it's a canvas, a variable to control, a forecast to manufacture. The big forecasting clock in the lobby, that was just the showpiece. There were dozens of side projects orbiting around it, little programs designed to model corporate seasonal flow, consumer decision fatigue, and even employee engagement decay rates. If you had enough data, the theory went, you could predict burnout, or office drama, or product market fit. You find a printout from 1967 labeled Temporal Behavior Metrics Revised Matrix. There's a graph that maps time of day against the likelihood of employees lying on internal surveys. According to the data, 4:15 p.m. on Wednesdays was when the most fibs were recorded. You make a mental note never to schedule HR meetings then. Everything here is about squeezing insight from the ticking clock. Every beep, every circuit, every filing cabinet is a declaration of war against randomness. You feel both awe and mild existential dread. It's one thing to check your watch. It's another thing entirely to worship it. You walk past a break room where someone's taped a Far Side cartoon to the fridge. It shows a man angrily shouting at a grandfather clock. "Fine, you win. I'll go to bed." Everyone here seems to get the joke. But the most surreal moment comes when you stumble into the hallway marked personnel synchronization and feedback alignment. Sounds bureaucratic, right? But inside, it's basically a small control room. 2 women monitoring a massive wall of analog dials and toggles, all labeled with employee IDs. At the top of the display, a glowing sign says, "Peak brain zones, current shift window, 9:37 to 11:11. Apparently, IBM had once mapped employee productivity across thousands of data points and found that most optimal thinking happened in tiny, weird windows. They used this data to schedule meetings, brainstorms, even when to serve coffee. One overly enthusiastic manager even proposed nap pods by neurological phase alignment. Unsurprisingly, it didn't pass budget approval. Still, it's strangely comforting. These people didn't want to waste your time. They wanted to perfect it, like watchmakers with mainframes. And here's the thing. You start to feel it too. You begin to notice the rhythm of it all. The way conversations pulse at predictable intervals. The way the halls empty and fill in synchronized waves. The soft chime at the hour that sounds less like a bell and more like a polite suggestion. It's as if this building doesn't run on electricity. It runs on time itself. And somewhere deep inside your brain, a thought clicks into place. Maybe the clock wasn't built to forecast the future. Maybe it was built to trap it. You lean back against the corridor wall. A soft vibration hums behind the plaster. Probably data cables, or more likely, a mechanized heartbeat trying to stay one step ahead of reality. You're still standing in that hallway, digesting the idea that IBM might be timing people like metronomes, when the door behind you creaks open. A man steps out, holding a clipboard, his tie slightly off-center, and his hair resisting whatever comb tried to tame it this morning. He blinks when he sees you, then smiles, nervously, like someone who's either very sleep-deprived or deeply aware that his project might be a little unhinged. "Jim O'Connell," he says, offering a hand. "You hear about the clock?" You nod, and he waves you in. The room smells like ozone, solder, and the lingering ghost of vending machine coffee. This is the beating heart of IBM's grand forecasting experiment. Not the polished showpiece in the lobby, but the guts, racks of buzzing machines, spaghetti tangles of cables, punch cards strewn like confetti on every surface. And in the center, hunched over a row of switches like a priest before an altar, is the man himself. Jim, engineer, dreamer, low-key prophet, and possibly a little mad. He motions for you to sit beside him on a metal stool, which squeaks as you lower yourself. You're not sure if it's going to collapse or salute. "Started as a side project," Jim mutters. "Just a way to model product cycles. But then the simulations got weirdly accurate." You blink. Weird how? He taps a glass panel on the console, lighting up a tiny display that reads, February 17th, 1971. Public toilet payment standardization begins. You raise an eyebrow. "That one actually happened," he says with a grin. "Japan." And that's when you realize Jim O'Connell isn't just the guy who ran the forecasting clock. He is the forecasting clock, or at least its high priest. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Jim O'Connell was a real systems analyst at IBM during the 1960s and 70s, known internally as Mr. Patton. He was behind several of the company's early predictive algorithms, used in logistics, marketing, and operations. His work laid the groundwork for what we now call machine learning, though back then it was more machine guessing with math. But here's your fringe tidbit. According to one internal memo, which Jim proudly tacks on his corkboard, His team once projected a brief utopia in 1993 due to optimal alignment of cultural mood and snack food innovation. Jim swears that's the year Cool Ranch Doritos came out. He might be right. He explains how the clock works, tapping through a series of mechanical relays and paper tape feeds. It's not a clock in the traditional sense. It's a glorified simulation engine. You input hundreds of variables: GDP data, moon phases, consumer behavior trends, weather patterns, stock returns, fashion cycles, newspaper sentiment, and then the system starts to chew. The trick, Jim says, adjusting his glasses, is biasing the probability model toward absurdity. We found the more ridiculous the projection sounded, the more often it came true. He pauses. Also, if you include 3 unrelated things, one of them usually hits. It's like future shooting buckshot. You glance at a teletype printout on the wall. It says, possible outcomes April 1974. Sneezing dog goes viral. Telephones become invisible. Men wear tights again. 1 out of 3 isn't bad. Jim shows you a simulation in progress. The room dims slightly as the system whirs to life, plotting a 35-year timeline in slowly scrolling lights. Each bulb lights up when a tipping point is reached. The terms flash across the display in red block letters. Minor outbreak of regional optimism. 1987. Corporate Mars flag planned. 1996. Electronic pets replace children. 2011. You try not to laugh, but honestly, that last one feels eerily plausible. Jim grins. We once fed it nothing but cereal sales, TV guide listings, and Pittsburgh weather reports. It predicted the collapse of the Berlin Wall 3 years early. You lean in. Are you serious? He nods solemnly. Deadly. Didn't know what wall it meant. We thought it was about a factory in Milwaukee. Still counts. He gestures to the mainframe behind you. We've had visitors from the Vatican. One guy wanted to use it to model miracle frequency per capita. Another guy from Sweden asked if it could forecast love. I said maybe, but only if they gave me their horoscopes and credit card receipts. You laugh, but your brain's still chewing on it. There's a strange sincerity here. A belief, not just in technology, but in pattern. In the idea that if you look closely enough, reality blinks back. Like the future isn't a mystery, it's just an equation we haven't solved yet. Jim leans back in his chair. Most of the execs think it's a joke, he says. But every now and then, they ask me to run a private simulation. You know, should we open a plant in Denver? Or will polyester come back? He grins. That last one got awkward. You glance at the walls, covered in handwritten notes, torn magazine pages, and rows of LED lights with labels like social discontent and undeclared dessert trends. The place is half control room, half conspiracy board. But there's no red string, just faith in data. You ask him if he's ever been scared by one of the projections. He doesn't answer right away. Finally, he points to a yellowed strip of tape pinned above his desk. Year 2020. System uncertainty at maximum, all signals ambiguous. What does that mean? You whisper. He shrugs. Beats me. Machine won't go past it. I tried forcing it once. It just blinked and printed good luck. Then it shut itself off for 3 days. You both sit in silence for a moment, listening to the soft clicking of relays. The hum of a future trying to organize itself. I guess that's the thing about clocks, Jim says finally. Even the fancy ones, they only tell you what was, until something comes along to change it. You're still sitting there next to Jim O'Connell in his humbly chaotic forecasting lair, as he leans forward and feeds a long ribbon of punched tape into the machine, like a priest offering incense. The tape shudders forward with a juddering noise that makes you feel like you're in a haunted pinball machine. You glance at the console and see one of the readouts start to twitch. A green light pulses next to a label that simply reads, Future Model, Iteration, 94B, the optimistic scenario. Jim cracks his knuckles, pulls out a yellow legal pad filled with shorthand notes and coffee stains and says, This one's a crowd favorite. Built it to simulate post-industrial Western economies through 2005. You nod like that's a normal thing to do on a Tuesday. And now the real show begins. The machine whirs into full throttle, little spools twirl, cards shuffle, Lights blink like they're trying to outdo each other for attention. And on the small cathode ray monitor in the corner, text begins to crawl across, narrating a play-by-play of tomorrow. It's not science fiction. It's pseudo-scientific corporate clairvoyance. You lean forward as the screen announces, 1975. Household robots become novelty consumer trend. Low adoption. 1982. Space tourism initiative fails after beef stroganoff incident. 1991. Domestic teleportation deemed too unpredictable for bureaucratic use. You cough-laugh at that last one. Bureaucracy and teleportation. Two things not known for speed. Jim watches your face and grins. Yeah, that one came from a correlation matrix of patent filings, sci-fi publication trends, and Bell Labs' cafeteria budget. You stare. Wait, cafeteria budget? He shrugs. More innovation during tuna salad quarters, oddly enough. Now here's your mainstream historical fact. By the late 1960s, IBM was doing real-world predictive modeling using early computing power. They partnered with universities and governments to simulate urban growth, traffic patterns, even crime probability. Some of these models were shockingly accurate. Others suggested Detroit would be a futuristic paradise by 1999. So, mixed bag. But the real showpiece here isn't just what the machine is predicting, it's how. The clock doesn't just project economic growth or political shifts, it strings them together like plot lines. You're not reading data, you're watching a story unfold. Jim pulls up a printout labeled Projection String, 1984 to 2004, and you scan the dotted letters. Fast food workers unionize in response to AI kitchen staff. Brief public panic over potato-based plastic pollution. Surge in demand for anti-melancholy music leads to rebranding of country genre. Each one feels absurd, until it doesn't. There's something about the way it all lines up. Cause and effect, action and reaction, like gears turning in sync. It's logic, plus vibes. And then Jim hands you a small stack of punch cards labeled Forecast Inputs Public Mood Indicators. You flip through them and realize they're coded from newspaper headlines, billboard ads, and even billboard graffiti. One card just reads, Doom Scrolling, Pre-Internet Equivalents. It's oddly self-aware for something written decades before smartphones. That one's mine, Jim says proudly. I figured if we could measure ambient dread levels in the 60s, we could maybe simulate collective vibes in the future. You try to think of a more IBM-sounding sentence and fail. He clicks a few switches and another batch of forecasts pour out. These feel more personal. Children stop playing outside after 1996. No one knows why. Laugh tracks disappear. Anxiety rises. Workplace productivity peaks when ambient music features saxophone solos. You look at Jim. Did any of these come true? He shrugs. I've stopped keeping score. Now, the fringe tidbit for this section. One junior engineer, bored on a night shift, once programmed the clock to simulate alternate histories. According to one simulation, if IBM had gone into breakfast cereal in 1963, they would have crushed Kellogg's by the late 70s. Another alt future saw them inventing a pet robot dog named Woofy 3000 and accidentally sparking a canine uprising. That one still lives on in whispered hallway jokes. You glance again at the main console, where the forecast summary is now reading. Projected year, 2002. Corporate paranoia reaches saturation. Meaningless rebranding initiatives follow. Jim chuckles. That one's based entirely on how many times the word synergy appeared in internal memos. You both sit for a while, just watching the future unfold in fake green letters. It's soothing in a way, like watching a lava lamp that thinks it's a time traveler. And there's something touching about it too. This wasn't just about forecasting the future. It was about understanding it, about reducing anxiety by pretending you could see what's coming next. Like a corporate security blanket, woven from code and bravado. Do you think it actually worked? You ask. Jim pauses. Sometimes, he says. But mostly, it made us feel like we were doing something useful. And in this business, that's half the job. You lean back and close your eyes for a second, letting the low-frequency hum of the machine lull your brain. For a brief moment, you can almost believe the future can be read. Not because it's inevitable, but because we're always, constantly reaching for it. You're leaning back in the chair, still digesting the eerie calm of simulated futures and cafeteria-based economic modeling, when Jim reaches over and pulls open a long metal drawer beneath the console. Inside, a stack of dusty printouts, labeled in thick black marker, forecast errors, highlights. He hands you the top one like it's a sacred text. These are the ones that didn't age so well, he says, with the sheepish grin of someone handing over their teenage poetry. You skim through the pages. They're filled with confidently printed declarations, each more gloriously wrong than the last. 1979. Mars-themed amusement parks dominate Midwest. 1983. VHS overtaken by microfiche-based home theater systems. 1992. Nationwide shortage of high-quality chewing gum leads to minor uprisings. Is this for real? You ask. Jim nods. We were so sure about that gum thing. You try not to laugh, but it's impossible. There's something so earnest about the whole endeavor. These weren't jokes. They were serious projections, backed by data, modeling, cross-reference patterns. But as it turns out, predicting the future is mostly just predicting what feels inevitable right now, and hoping the world agrees. Jim shows you a poster someone made back in '68, tacked up behind his desk. It's a timeline labeled, IBM's future according to the clock. Each decade is filled with sweeping pronouncements. Some hilariously wrong, others uncomfortably close. 1970s, rise of executive mood monitoring. Automated meal cubicles become office standard. Widespread mistrust of salad. 1980s, people develop nostalgia for primitive screens. Robots assist with dreams, experimental. Europe reinvents weather. 1990s, democracy becomes user-interfaced. Return of sweater culture. Public transportation sings now. Jim points to that last one and deadpans. To be fair, some of the trains in Tokyo do play little jingles. You smirk and keep flipping through the forecasts. The sheer confidence behind each line is delightful. There's no hemming, no maybe or possibly. Just bold declarations from a machine that knew. Now your mainstream historical fact. Forecasting failures aren't unique to IBM. In the 20th century, almost every major company tried their hand at futurism. Ford predicted nuclear-powered cars. Rand Corp imagined paperless cities by 1975. Even Disney envisioned a robot butler revolution that stubbornly never arrived. But here's a fringe tidbit you probably haven't heard. One IBM internal memo from 1971 insisted that, eventually, humans will abandon chairs, and there were actual design mock-ups for zero-posture workstations, which looked suspiciously like futuristic beanbags strapped to the ceiling. They were shelved after several interns fell asleep mid-simulation. Jim retrieves another report labeled, Top Forecasted Consumer Products That Never Happened. You read aloud, sweat-neutralizing clothing, edible phones, office chair with built-in guilt sensors, toaster that rates your dreams. You blink. Did the dream toaster make it to prototype? Sort of, Jim says. It mostly just burned toast and called it performance feedback. There's something almost tender about these flops. The machine wasn't just wrong, it was optimistically wrong. It overestimated our whimsy, our ambition, our willingness to redesign society around hot new ideas. It thought we were bolder than we are. In a way, that's flattering. You sit down again beside the console, and Jim shows you a button labeled Alt Probability Mode. What's that do? He hesitates. It runs simulations assuming humans get their act together. You press it. The screen flickers, whirs, and displays a simple, serene message. 2040, world hunger resolved. Trusting governments, 94%. Commuting obsolete. Dogs elected to low-level office. Jim leans over your shoulder and whispers, that last one was added by Larry. He really wanted his pug to be city comptroller. You shake your head and smile. There's something endearing about watching this machine dream. That's what this is, really. Not prophecy. Not even probability. It's structured dreaming. Fantasies dressed up in code. Spit out by a machine that still somehow believes in us. You ask Jim how they kept track of what the clock got right. He points to a giant spreadsheet pinned to the corkboard titled Machine Wins, O'Connell Confidence Index. There are 3 columns: prediction, year targeted, outcome, kind of, sort of, or nope. Some examples: portable music devices, 1978, kind of. Video communication everywhere, 1990, sort of. World adopts Esperanto, 1986, nope. Jim circles 1. Mild social collapse followed by return to card games, 2021, kind of. I mean, he gestures vaguely. We weren't entirely off. And now you realize the real gift of the forecasting clock wasn't in its predictions. It was in the practice of it. The ritual of imagining possible futures. The comfort of thinking someone, or something, had an idea where we were going. You flip to the very last forecast in the binder. It reads, 2051, humans look back and laugh, hopefully. You close the binder gently and nod. You're still holding the final page of that binder when Jim reaches over and flicks a switch on the side of the main console. A small motor groans to life, and a hidden drawer slowly slides open, revealing a panel with dials, sliders, and a single ominous red light labeled Mood Module, Experimental. Let me show you something truly unnecessary, Jim says, smiling like a magician before the final trick. The clock has feelings. You blink. It what? Oh yeah, he says, tapping the panel. We gave it an emotional state back in 72, just for fun. Or maybe as a dare. There were long nights. You watch as he slides a control labeled Stimulus Input toward the right, past a notch labeled Mildly Irritated, to one marked Existential Funk. The machine's lights dim slightly. A small tone emits from the speaker, a soft, melancholic beep that sounds like a robot sighing. You feel ridiculous for anthropomorphizing a box of circuits, but for a moment you swear the machine looks disappointed. Here's your mainstream historical fact. IBM experimented with effective computing concepts far earlier than most people realize. While they weren't building sentient AIs in the 1970s, they were playing with the idea that computers could respond to human tone, pace, or even facial expressions. A few departments even logged emotional input models into early user interfaces, usually to adjust feedback speed or visual cues. But here's your weird tidbit. A 1973 IBM internal memo, found crumpled behind a filing cabinet and preserved in folklore, outlined the proposed phases of a machine empathy module. The stages? 1. Basic mood reflection, sad, happy. 2. Personality profiling, sarcastic, agreeable, dramatic. 3. Weekly pep talks generated for staff morale. 4. Possible participation in Office Secret Santa. Only stage 1 was ever implemented, and even then it mostly just dimmed the lights whenever it rained outside. Jim points to a dial labeled Environmental Mood Sync and says, on Tuesdays it gets moody, especially if it's cloudy. Once it printed nothing but the word map for 3 hours. You laugh. It invented ennui. Kind of. We think it was mimicking our energy. He flips through a folder labeled Mood-Linked Forecast Variants and shows you 2 printouts generated on different days with the same inputs. Version A, Sunny Monday. Global cooperation increases. Renewable energy breakthroughs. Public hugs surge. Version B, Rainy Thursday. Mild dystopia, nostalgia for horses, cereal shortages continue. So yeah, Jim says, we learned pretty fast. Don't trust the clock on gloomy days. Or before it's had its simulated coffee cycle. You glance at the panel and notice a dial that reads, Sleep deprivation sync on. You didn't. Oh, we absolutely did, he says. One of the interns thought if we mirrored our own exhaustion into the machine, it would bond with us. It mostly just started predicting snack-related violence. There's something beautiful and unhinged about all of this. These weren't hardened futurists building Terminator-style world domination tools. These were office nerds with too much creativity, too little oversight, and just enough spare circuits to ask, what if a computer had moods? You sit with that for a minute. The idea that a machine could have a bad day. That forecasts could change based on whether the forecast felt optimistic. There's poetry in that. The raw absurdity of people trying to turn logic into emotion, and then watching that logic loop back and spit emotion right back at them. You ask Jim, did it ever scare you? The moods, I mean? He leans back. Once, we were modeling future city layouts. Everything was going fine. Then suddenly the machine refused to simulate beyond 2022. It printed, urban optimism exceeded, retracting hope. You let out a breath. That's unsettling. Jim nods solemnly. We unplugged it and left for the weekend. He pulls out another sheet. This one labeled Mood-Based Projections, Pet Industry. You read aloud. Joyful Clock State, Mode 7. 2030 sees rise in hedgehog popularity. Melancholic Clock State, Mode 3. 2030 sees decline in pet ownership, surge in robot companionship. Anxious Clock State, Mode 9. Widespread hoarding of emotional support ducks. I feel like Mode 9 is where we've been living since 2016, you joke. Jim laughs. You're not wrong. What becomes clear is that the mood module wasn't meant to be serious. It was a prank, a thought experiment. But, like so many of the great IBM oddities, it somehow worked. It gave the machine character. It made people think about the data differently, more human, less binary. Eventually, the execs got wind of it. The mood module was officially removed in 1974, after someone used it to justify a failed product launch by claiming the clock was just feeling pessimistic that quarter. After that, it became an inside joke. Don't blame Bob, he's just having a clock day. Jim still keeps the old module around, though. Sometimes he hooks it up, just to watch the old lights flicker like eyelids at half-mast. Makes me feel like she's still thinking, he murmurs. You realize he just used a pronoun for the machine. You say nothing. Because honestly, you kind of feel it too. The warmth, the hum, the tired little beep that echoes like a sigh. There's an old soul inside that console, a ghost made of algorithms and bad coffee and misplaced optimism. You reach over and slide the mood dial to curious. The machine pauses, then lights up with a single word, maybe. You're still sitting there, watching the clock ponder the word maybe, when Jim flips another switch. This one labeled public mode. With a clunk and a shudder, the console's internal printer hums to life, spitting out thick paper reels onto the floor. Here we go, Jim mutters. Time to watch a room full of executives pretend they understand probability. You raise an eyebrow. This is what you showed to the press? He nods. Yep. Marketing loved the idea of a prophecy machine. You should have seen the launch demo. Absolute theatre. He rummages through a box labelled Press Kits, Performance Disclaimers, and pulls out a glossy brochure. On the cover, in futuristic Helvetica, are the words, IBM Clock, your tomorrow today. Beneath that, a black and white photo of a suited man pointing confidently at a screen full of blinking lights, smiling like he'd just solved the Cold War. Jim chuckles. That's Dave. He tripped over the power cord 2 minutes later. Here's your mainstream historical fact. IBM was famous for turning internal experiments into slick public-facing demos. From world's fairs to corporate trade shows, they loved framing their technology as not just business tools, but glimpses into a better future. And with the forecasting clock, they smelled a story. It was 1968 when they first debuted it publicly. They dressed it up, replacing wires with sleek panels, hiding the punch card readers behind frosted glass, and adding a very dramatic name, the Chronologic Insight Engine. It even got a voice, a smooth, pre-recorded baritone that would read out projections in a reassuring mid-Atlantic accent. By 1985, homes will come pre-installed with computing centers. The rise of algae-based protein will shape dinner tables by the late 1990s. In 2007, cities will compete for clean air like gold. You grin. It's oddly soothing, even when it's wrong. Jim hands you a VHS tape labeled Public Demo Chicago Business Expo. He pushes it into a dusty monitor cart and hits play. The tape flickers to life, showing a crowd of businessmen nodding solemnly as a presenter in a navy suit gestures at the clock like it's the Ark of the Covenant. "We stand," the presenter intones, "on the threshold of a future only data can describe." Cut to a wide shot of the clock spitting out a forecast. Possible economic peak in 1993. Likely cause synchronized global nap culture. You hear a few titters from the audience, followed by a round of very serious applause. Jim pauses the tape. They didn't care if it was accurate. They cared that it sounded confident. You nod. Makes sense. In the business world, sometimes the illusion of certainty is worth more than certainty itself. Then he hands you a memo labeled Clock Talking Points Sales Division. It's full of phrases like, replaces uncertainty with insight. Your competitive edge lives in tomorrow's numbers. The only machine that understands ambition. But the best part? A footnote at the bottom. Avoid direct questions. Refer to projections as a probability narratives. Do not promise robot butlers. Jim shrugs. One guy in Phoenix really wanted a robot butler. Legal had to step in. Now for the fringe tidbit. During one of the clock's earliest public displays, a junior staffer fed it a batch of fictional data as a prank. The clock proudly printed, "The moon will demand independence by 2025. Brace for lunar trade tariffs." The room went quiet. One executive nodded solemnly and wrote it down. So yeah, marketing didn't always get the joke. Eventually, IBM created a sanitized version of the clock, small enough to ship. A simplified forecasting display they could set up in regional offices. It didn't actually forecast anything. It just blinked lights in patterns and offered vague predictions like, growth is likely if alignment remains stable. But it looked fancy, sounded smart, and gave clients something to point at when they didn't understand what the software guys were saying. They even released a user guide. It included such timeless tips as, do not attempt to modify timeline settings. Forecasts may vary based on humidity. The clock cannot predict sports outcomes. Please stop asking. Jim rolls his eyes. Everyone wanted to know if the Yankees would win, every year. Still, the machine developed a weird kind of fan base. Internal staff began calling it the Prophet. Journalists wrote think pieces with titles like, "Can a clock be more honest than a politician?" And execs started making decisions based, if not entirely on its printouts, then at least on the vibe it gave off. It was like a corporate horoscope, Jim says, except printed in all caps and less forgiving. You glance down at one of the official forecast cards. It reads, warning, too many variables, clarify desire. And somehow, that hits a little too close to home. In the end, it didn't matter if the clock was accurate. It mattered that it felt like the future. In a world of quarterly reports and PowerPoints, it offered magic, wrapped in data tape and blinking bulbs. You lean back, picturing a room full of suited execs asking the clock if their Q4 expansion strategy would pay off, while the machine buzzed thoughtfully and whispered, possibly, if the moon is in the right mood. You're still chuckling over the clock's vague proclamations and lunar tariffs when Jim leans forward, elbows on his knees, and says, "Want to know the weird part? We actually started taking it seriously." You raise an eyebrow. "More seriously than robot butlers?" "Oh yeah," he nods. "For a few years, we let it steer decisions, not just marketing fluff. Real stuff. Budget allocations, hiring plans, product timelines. It became part of the process." You feel the shift in tone. This isn't the whimsical clock that predicted hug surges and edible phones. This is the era where the machine crossed the line, from novelty to navigator. Jim reaches for a thick binder labeled Internal Strategy Reports, Clock Referenced, and flips it open. Inside are memos, spreadsheets, and printouts where executive decisions are annotated with phrases like, Clock Model 3C suggests delay. Per scenario, Path 7.1 launching Q3 preferred. Forecast flags increase brand sentiment post-March lull. Recommended pivot to optimism. It's all very confident, measured, scary. Here's your mainstream historical fact. During the 1970s, IBM used increasingly advanced simulation models in corporate strategy and long-term planning. These models often influenced supply chain decisions, product rollouts, and even political lobbying strategies. While not always public-facing, internal forecasts were heavily consulted and, in some departments, borderline gospel, with the fringe tidbit. One executive reportedly refused to sign off on any project unless the clock approved it. His nickname around the office was Clock Daddy. Jim winces. It was weird. We didn't talk about it. You flip through another document labeled IBM Product Viability Forecast, 1976. It shows 4 products being evaluated, from punch card replacements to something called home communicator boxes. Next to each is a clock-derived score. The highest one reads 88% likely success if public appetite for information outpaces screen anxiety. Jim sighs. We killed it anyway. Too risky. Turns out the clock couldn't override boardroom nerves. That became a pattern. The clock gave confidence, but not always courage. Projects that got green lights from the machine sometimes still died in committee. People loved data. They just didn't always like what it said. But some things did go through. Jim shows you a timeline of decisions made with clock guidance. 1975. Shift toward modular components based on long-term forecast of consumer customization culture. 1979. Delay in launching optical disc project due to forecasted backlash against invisible tech. 1981. Expansion into educational tech prompted by clock's prediction of digital learning explosion by early 90s. Some of these hit. Some didn't. There was the Home Tutor Hub prototype. A giant plastic terminal meant to teach children math with soothing robotic voices. It was quietly buried after one too many kids had nightmares about long division. Still, the clock had its believers. Departments began requesting custom forecasts, personalized reports, like tarot readings with graphs. One memo from 1980 reads, requesting clock insight. Will market accept talking printers? The answer, consumers enjoy novelty, acceptance likely, beware of pun backlash. Jim leans in. That printer was named Wordy. It made puns as it printed. You cringe. Was it successful? Oh no, it was an HR violation with a plug. You flip to another section of the binder. Clock-influenced hiring practices. Apparently, the HR department once experimented with time-based performance prediction. They fed in resumes, company morale data, lunar cycles, and cafeteria sales, and tried to model who'd make the best regional manager. The clock's top pick? Sally M., mid-level accounting, snacks during meetings, smiles under pressure. Sally did get the promotion. She also accidentally erased 6 years of financial records and fled to Peru. Jim groans. The clock forgot to factor in impulse control. Still, despite its flaws, the clock influenced everything. Not because it was perfect, but because it gave people the illusion that someone was looking ahead. That decisions weren't just made in boardrooms, but in dialogue with destiny. You pick up a thin booklet labeled Interpreting the Clock, Internal Training Guide. It reads like a cross between a user manual and a new age pamphlet. Trust trends, not absolutes. Question clusters over time, not single spikes. When uncertain, observe the clock's rhythm. You smirk. Sounds a little spiritual. Jim shrugs. Well, it was the 70s. Eventually, some execs pushed back. They didn't like being told their gut feelings weren't data-backed. A few called the clock an overhyped yes man in a metal box. One memo simply reads, "We've got enough bureaucrats. We don't need prophetic ones." But the clock had defenders too, people who believed in its quiet wisdom, who saw its blinking lights not as distractions but lighthouses. Jim was one of them. Was it ever right, you ask? Like, really right? He thinks for a long moment, then nods slowly. There was a forecast in 78. Said if we didn't start building mobile computing solutions, we'd lose relevance by the 2000s. Management laughed it off. You both sit there in silence. Then Jim whispers, "Guess who's laughing now?" You let your eyes drift to the console again. It's humming softly. A new printout slides out of the tray. You pick it up. It reads, 2024, faith in data waivers, nostalgia for analog wisdom surges, guidance sought from outdated systems. You look at Jim. That sounds a little on the nose. He shrugs. The clock still has good days, and maybe that's the legacy, not perfect predictions, not flawless forecasts, but the idea that sometimes you don't need to know exactly what's coming. You just need a blinking, buzzing friend in the corner to tell you you're trying. Section 9. You're still holding that eerily accurate forecast. Faith in data waivers. When Jim stands up and says, there's one more part of the story that gets weird. He gestures for you to follow him down a narrower hallway, past flickering fluorescents and dusty filing cabinets with labels like clock-related complaints, mild, and forecast printouts, optimistic tone only. You come to a locked door marked Interdepartmental Collaborations Clearance Level 2+. Jim produces a key from around his neck, attached to a lanyard that reads, Ask me about the future. He unlocks the door and waves you in. Inside is a dimly lit room with a single long table and a wall covered in maps, red string, and printouts stamped Confidential External Agency Coordination. This is where things stopped being fun and started being important. Jim closes the door behind you. So, at some point the government found out about the clock. You blink. Of course they did. Here's your mainstream historical fact. IBM was a major contractor for the US government during the Cold War, especially in defense logistics, infrastructure simulations, and data processing. Their expertise in computing made them a natural partner for everything from census work to top-secret predictive modeling. If you've ever wondered how the Pentagon processed information in the 60s, it probably went through IBM hardware. Now, the fringe tidbit. In 1972, a Defense Department liaison visited the forecasting clock lab, not just for a tour, but with a request. Could it model geopolitical tension escalation timelines? You know, just in case World War III needed a heads up. Jim points to a yellowed file labeled Operation Redline. Inside, simulations predicting the outcomes of escalating military postures, economic sanctions, trade wars, and even weather weaponry. They gave us access to tons of data, he says, and in exchange they wanted timelines. How long until a blockade leads to war? What happens if oil prices spike during an election? Stuff like that. You flip through a few of the scenarios. They read like dystopian fanfic with a government budget. Scenario 4A, submarine detected, misinterpretation of intent, limited conflict, short duration. Scenario 7B, simultaneous grain shortage and pop music backlash, domestic instability likely. Scenario 12F, Soviet misreading of baseball metaphor, escalation to diplomatic freeze. You look up. Wait, baseball? Jim nods. One ambassador once used the phrase 3 strikes and you're out in a press statement. They thought it was a threat. You sigh. So the clock was basically mediating an accidental sports-based war. Essentially, yes. The machine, for its part, didn't mind. It processed diplomatic tension like it did everything else, through numbers, trends, and faintly sarcastic outputs. One of the more unsettling reports simply read, probability of widespread miscommunication, 82%. Outcome, nervous laughter followed by missiles. You stare at the paper for a long second. This was the moment, Jim says, when the clock's role shifted again. It wasn't just a quirky sideshow. It wasn't just a business tool. It was now, unofficially, a national consultant. IBM never called it that, but everyone in this room knew. The data mattered, and the clock was watching patterns no one else could. At one point, a model was run to see how long it would take for public confidence to collapse if leaders started using contradictory statements daily. The clock printed 13 months, he'd cheese 2 depending on snacks. You blink. Wait, snacks? Jim shrugs. Apparently, public resilience improves with pretzel availability. You start to see why people got hooked. This wasn't forecasting. It was social X-ray. The clock wasn't making the future. It was poking it with a stick to see where it hurt. Jim hands you a folder titled Forecasting Social Stability Metrics Urban Centers. Inside are maps with color-coded regions, yellow for calm, orange for tension accumulating, red for spicy. You raise a brow. Spicy. That was Larry again. He got bored halfway through the categorization system. Despite the labels, the system was taken seriously. In fact, Jim says, there was once an internal memo from the Department of Energy asking whether the clock could predict the fallout of a nuclear misunderstanding. The clock just blinked for 3 hours, he says. We took that as a bad sign. Still, the government kept feeding it data, not just military scenarios, but social trends, psychological surveys, even regional TV ratings. One simulation suggested that sitcom laughter density could correlate with public optimism, a theory so absurd it was accidentally genius. Another predicted that the sudden disappearance of a hit soap opera might incite mass unrest in Minnesota. They ran that model twice, just in case. You find another folder labeled Celebrity Scandals and Political Fallout, Probable Correlation Matrix. It lists scenarios like teen heartthrob tax evasion, increased Senate hearings by 14%. Late-night show cancellation. Civic engagement drops 4.2% in cities under 500k. Royal divorce. Temporary spike in online diplomacy forums. Jim shrugs. It's all inputs. Every little twitch in culture echoes somewhere. You look again at the blinking machine, now just humming quietly in the corner. Once just a clunky side project. Now, a secret oracle consulted by suits in both boardrooms and briefing rooms. And the wildest part, no one really understood how it worked. They fed it data, they read the outputs, they followed, or ignored, its advice. But under all that, it was still just a hunk of hardware. A hunk of hardware that, for a while, was trusted with the biggest questions of them all. What happens next? And what do we do about it? You feel a chill. Not because the clock might be right, but because it might not be. Section 10. You leave the interdepartmental collaborations room with a strange mix of reverence and unease swirling in your chest. It's one thing for a machine to forecast serial trends or pet popularity, but it's another to realize that at one point, IBM's clock tried to stare down the sheer chaos of geopolitics, and people listened. Jim doesn't say much as you walk back to the lab, until you pass a hallway with the faint smell of stale coffee and overheated plastic. He stops in front of a door that reads, Financial Modeling Division, formerly break room. Inside is a cramped space filled with beige desks, sagging whiteboards, and one particularly angry-looking printer. On the back wall, there's a dusty banner that says, Can we beat the market? Someone's added a post-it beneath it. No, Jim chuckles. Welcome to the era of clock versus capitalism. You take a seat on a rolling chair that has clearly seen better fiscal years. Jim pulls a stack of faded folders from a filing cabinet labeled Wall Street Bold Attempts. He fans them out across the table. Here's your mainstream historical fact. IBM was heavily involved in financial modeling throughout the 1970s and 1980s, developing systems to assist with portfolio management, risk analysis, and algorithmic predictions. Many of these early tools paved the way for today's AI-driven trading platforms. But this was different. We wanted to see if the clock could outthink the market, Jim explains. Not just read it, anticipate it, ride it like a surfer who thinks in probabilities. They built a new subroutine, Scenario G12, Economic Sentiment Drift, designed to detect when public mood would preemptively shift stock values, even before the news broke. It ran simulations on everything. Interest rates, newspaper language, even how optimistic soap commercials were getting. One test prediction from 1976 reads, June, begin buying paper companies. September, public rediscovery of stationery. You squint. Did that actually happen? Jim shrugs. Sort of. People bought a lot of notebooks that year. You flip to another page. 1981. Forecast anticipates rise in computing stocks following cultural fatigue with plaid. You raise a brow. That's oddly specific. Jim nods. And weirdly correct. Still, not everything was a win. They tried using clock forecasts to build an internal investment fund. They called it the temporal trust. It was designed to invest based only on clock projections, no human override allowed. It lasted 5 weeks, Jim sighs. You lean in. What happened? The clock recommended a heavy pivot into ferret insurance futures. Don't ask. The financial team didn't love the clock. Traders wanted sharp, simple answers. The clock, on the other hand, often gave forecasts like volatility likely, beware confidence. Markets crave narrative. This quarter lacks plot. Proceed with restraint, unless compelled by orange juice trends. There was even a brief movement to create what one exec called the clock index, a synthetic stock portfolio derived from its forecasts. For about 6 months, it outperformed the S&P 500. Then the clock decided it didn't like the letter Q and dropped any company with a Q in its ticker symbol. That was a weird quarter, Jim says. Cantor's went down, so did Q-Tip's parent company. Honestly, Q got wrecked. You find a laminated chart titled Clock-Inspired Trading Principles. Buy when buzzwords align. Sell when confidence accelerates faster than relevance. Never trust a quiet Tuesday. Past behavior is a story, not a guide. You read that last one again. Doesn't sound like a forecast, it sounds like philosophy. And here's your fringe tidbit. One analyst working with the clock began inputting his dream journal entries alongside financial data to see if there was subconscious predictive power. For 3 days, the clock started printing. Market confidence surges if analysts stop dreaming about raincoats. He stopped. The markets dipped. Coincidence, probably, but the guy swore by it. At the height of clock-driven financial enthusiasm, someone even built a prototype trader's companion terminal, essentially a desktop version of the clock that issued gentle alerts like, too soon to buy. Fear is spiking in Dallas. Consider introspection before executing trades. They sold 6 units, 5 were returned, 1 was stolen. Jim suspects it's still somewhere in Hoboken, quietly trying to short existential dread. But despite the machine's poor batting average in wealth accumulation, the clock earned a certain affection from financial teams. It never panicked, Jim says. It never got greedy. It never told us what we wanted to hear, just what it saw. You glance over at the console where a fresh strip of paper is emerging. You walk over and pull it free. It reads, "Next correction likely to begin unnoticed. Trust in shadows. Watch for mint prices." You read it aloud. Jim nods sagely. Ah yes, the classic mint index. A timeless economic indicator. You both burst out laughing. But when the laughter fades, there's something poignant in the air. Because deep down you realize the clock was trying to do the impossible. Tame capitalism. Forecast human greed. Make sense of irrational exuberance. And it failed, gloriously. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was that, for a little while, people believed they could make decisions without fear. That the future wasn't just random. That a bunch of humming circuits in a beige box could care, in its own mechanical way, about doing right by the people feeding it data. And even if it never made anyone rich, it made them feel ready. You're still chuckling over the mint index as Jim leads you into a quieter wing of the lab. This area is dimly lit, carpeted with worn linoleum, and decorated in what you generously describe as government beige. The walls are lined with whiteboards covered in doodles, charts, and one particularly chaotic graph labelled Public Confidence versus Office Chair Comfort, 1974-1979. The curve resembles a sad roller coaster. This, Jim says, gesturing dramatically, is where things got personal. You glance around. There are desks pushed together, half-empty coffee mugs fossilized from the Ford administration, and a corkboard labeled Unofficial Clock Experiments for Fun Only. Seriously. You step closer. Tacked to the board are dozens of printouts, each one headed by strange prompts. Will Bob finally ask Karen out? Should we order tacos this Friday? Is Dave faking that cough? Does the copier have a soul? Jim grins sheepishly. We started using the clock for less than corporate applications. You stare. You used a multi-million-dollar forecasting engine to gossip? Oh, absolutely, he says proudly. And don't act surprised. This is exactly what happens when you give nerds access to God. Here's your mainstream historical fact. As companies like IBM grew more reliant on internal systems for data analysis, employees increasingly experimented with those systems for personal use, from games to jokes to workplace bets. Early mainframes were used to simulate romance compatibility, generate bad poetry, and in one infamous case, calculate the ideal number of donuts per department. But here's your fringe tidbit. IBM's forecasting clock had its own underground, following among employees who used it as a sort of corporate oracle. They called it the Whisperer. Not officially, of course, but whenever someone had a decision they couldn't make, they'd sneak into the lab and type in a question, and the clock always answered. Jim walks you to a terminal labeled Personal Query Station, Beta, a keyboard and printer nestled in a corner surrounded by sticky notes with labels like "No questions about sports" and "Do not feed the clock after 5 p.m. You'd be amazed how many love lives this thing touched, he says. We even built a subroutine, Heart Math. You raise a brow. I don't like that name. You're not supposed to. The program analyzed patterns from staff interactions, meeting schedules, cafeteria seating proximity, frequency of shared coffee breaks, and generated a single forecast score, emotional alignment probability, EAP. It was somewhere between Tinder and a magic 8-ball, but with more bureaucracy. You scroll through past queries. Will Sandra say yes if I bring her that book? 68% likely. Should I admit I broke the stapler? Not today. Can I pull off turtlenecks? Proceed with caution. Jim points to one printout tacked on the wall, framed in an old pizza box lid. Is happiness achievable during Q2? Response. Temporarily. With donuts. It became a tradition, Jim explains. Fridays at 3, someone would type in a clock question, and we'd all gather for the printout. Whatever it said, we did it. One week, the clock said, everyone needs fresh air. Take your projects outside. So they moved the entire lab to the parking lot. Half the punch cards blew away. Morale hit an all-time high. Then there was the legendary week it printed. Today is the day. Confess your secrets. Bake something first. You don't ask what happened. You're not sure you want to know. But it wasn't just fun and games. People felt something when the clock responded. A weird connection. Like it wasn't just crunching numbers. It was listening. You read one particularly poignant card. Am I doing okay? You're tired, but yes. That one's signed by at least 12 employees. In ink, like a petition to believe it. Eventually, someone started using it for birthday messages. Another created clock horoscopes, short mood forecasts based on badge numbers. They were posted weekly in the break room. One example, if your ID ends in 3, today is weird, be weirder. Another, ending in 9, don't trust the elevator, or Greg. You glance at Jim. Did Greg ever find out? He was the one writing them. And then came the office pool, the forecasting pool. A betting game based on how accurate the clock would be in forecasting personal events. Not company earnings, not product timelines. Stuff like, will it rain during our company picnic? Will Bob actually bring his famous ribs this time? Will Helen finally change her email signature? People placed bets, winners got coffee vouchers, the clock became family. One employee even asked it what their baby's name should be. The clock responded, name her June, it's always a good month. They did. June's now a software engineer. You ask Jim if anyone ever got too into it. He nods slowly. There was Martin. He stopped making decisions without the clock, even for lunch. One day it told him to try egg salad. He never came back. He waits a beat. Kidding. He just got transferred to Atlanta. Still, HR eventually stepped in, issued a formal memo. Reminder. The forecasting clock is not a therapist, romantic advisor, or medical tool. Please treat it with appropriate respect. The team framed it and hung it in the bathroom. Looking around now, at all the yellowing printouts and scrawled questions, it's clear. The clock wasn't just predicting trends. It was part of the culture. It absorbed not just data, but doubt. All the unspoken questions employees had, the fears, the little hopes, the silly bets, funneled into this buzzing machine like prayers to a digital saint. You reach down and type, "What happens if I believe in this?" The clock hums, prints. Then maybe you're not alone. You're still staring at that little slip of paper. Then maybe you're not alone. When Jim gently folds it and slides it into a drawer filled with others just like it, each one an unanswered question, or maybe a deeply personal answer from a machine that technically doesn't understand what feelings are, but occasionally hits the emotional bullseye anyway. Then he sighs and motions you over to another part of the lab, darker now, lit mostly by the flickering green glow of ancient monitors and one small lava lamp. "This," he says, "is where it started to fall apart." He pulls back a sheet covering a chunk of rusted metal, wires exposed like a nervous system mid-dissection. You squint. It's part of the clock, but it looks off, like it's been through something. Jim taps it. The metal emits a soft groan. "That," he says, "is the segment we nicknamed Cassandra." You pause. "As in, the prophet no one believed?" Bingo. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the early 1980s, IBM was winding down many of its experimental divisions in favor of more focused commercial computing. Projects like the forecasting clock were seen as whimsical relics. Interesting, maybe even brilliant, but not profitable. Budgets tightened, labs were consolidated, dreamers got reassigned to product support. But Cassandra fought back. Jim explains, sometime around 1982, the clock began outputting stranger forecasts. More ambiguous, harder to pass. At first, they chalked it up to wear and tear, corrupted punch cards, maybe a spilled Mountain Dew in the circuit bay. But then the messages took on a new tone. He hands you a stack of them. You read aloud. "The center cannot hold. Update your filing systems. Reconsider the color beige. Tomorrow is over. Proceed to next available present." They sound like weird poetry or machine riddles. Jim nods. It stopped giving probabilities, started giving statements. You flip through more. Some are cryptic, some are hilarious, some make your skin crawl. "Do not schedule meetings after 3:17 p.m. Someone is deleting memories. Back up your analog selves. Laughter is scheduled to expire by 1996. Reinvest." You look up. Were these just glitches? Jim scratches his head. Maybe. Or maybe it just evolved past usefulness. They tried everything, cleaned the hardware, rewrote the parsing software, recalibrated the mood module. Nothing helped. Cassandra kept printing weirder, more unsettling outputs. One week it printed the word "nope" 462 times in a row, then shut itself off for 5 hours. Another time it generated a forecast in perfect Latin, a language no one in the lab spoke. When they translated it, it simply said, "The future is tired." That was kind of the final straw, Jim says. But not everyone gave up. Some staff grew obsessed with the idea that Cassandra knew something, that she was warning them. A few even started running separate simulations based solely on her cryptic messages. They tried to decode tone shifts, analyze punctuation changes, even counted the syllables like it was a secret haiku. They never figured it out, but some of them claimed Cassandra was sentient. You ask Jim if he ever believed that. He hesitates, then shrugs. Not sentient, but aware. There's a difference. Then he shows you the forecast that finally made them disconnect the Cassandra unit altogether. Reads, "Prediction terminated, you already know, stop asking." And that was that. They boxed up Cassandra, rerouted the clock's mainframe through safer, cleaner algorithms, and the system slowly went back to spitting out sanitized trend lines and economic guesses. The whimsy faded, so did the magic. But Cassandra never really left. Jim pulls out a stack of informal memos, the clock rumors file. Over the years, staff claimed Cassandra's code fragments somehow survived in the system. They said certain forecasts still bore her tone, slightly more cynical, vaguely poetic, often vaguely threatening. One reads, "Your strategy is technically sound, but emotionally hollow." Another, "They will forget what you built, smile anyway." And then there was the one that appeared during a 1984 quarterly meeting. "They think they lead, but the machine has been waiting. No one admitted to printing it. Jim chuckles darkly. The running joke was that Cassandra had a temper, that she hated PowerPoint. Honestly, same. Here's your fringe tidbit. During a system audit in 1985, someone discovered a small, unmarked directory buried deep in the clock's storage. It contained hundreds of unnamed text files, each one a single sentence. No timestamps, no metadata, just pure unprompted forecasts like, one day the questions will stop. The most important thing you'll forget was your favorite lunch order. Don't name it if you want it to last. They wiped the directory, or thought they did. Every now and then, one of those sentences still shows up, printed during a test run, included in a quarterly report footer, whispered in the blank space between normality. Jim gently sets the Cassandra panel back in its resting place. She got under our skin, he says. Not because she was right, but because she spoke like she knew what we were afraid to admit. You take a breath. The room unusually quiet now. No humming, no blinking lights. Just you, Jim, and the ghost of a machine that once tried to speak too honestly about the future. And maybe that's the risk of any oracle, digital or otherwise. Eventually, it stops telling you what might happen and starts telling you what already has. The Cassandra unit is still on your mind as Jim leads you down yet another corridor. This one lined with poster boards, surplus filing cabinets, and a tragic potted plant that looks like it gave up in 1987. You pass a door labeled Archival Overflow Missed, and beneath that, in ballpoint pen, do not touch the skeleton. You don't ask. Jim doesn't explain. You move on. Eventually, you arrive at a storage closet. He swings it open with a theatrical flourish to reveal a mannequin torso, a broken modem, and the forecasting clock's primary console, dormant now, wires coiled like tired snakes around its base. This, he says, is how it ended, not with a bang, with a, well, sad closet. You peer at the console. It's surprisingly small, or maybe you just imagined it bigger after all those stories. The screen is blank, the paper feed is silent. A faint smell of dry plastic and ambition clings to the air. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In 1983, IBM quietly retired the forecasting clock project. The hardware was outdated, the predictions increasingly inconsistent, and the culture had shifted toward faster, more modular analytics tools. Forecasting was no longer an experimental art. It had become a standardized business service. But here's the tender part, the fringe tidbit. They didn't destroy the clock. They didn't sell it for parts. They didn't even bother to fully disassemble it. They just wheeled it into a corner and turned off the lights. Jim kneels beside the console and opens a small panel, revealing a handwritten note taped inside. You crouch to read it. You did your best. We're sorry we asked too much. It hits harder than you expect. I thought we were nuts for writing that, Jim murmurs. But after everything, after all the hours and bad coffee and weirdly accurate pet forecasts, it felt wrong to just unplug her without a goodbye. You glance around the room. There's a deflated exercise ball in the corner. A stack of user manuals used as a monitor stand. And right on top of the console, a crumpled paper crown. Someone made it from a forecast strip that reads, "Wednesday feels royal." Jim brushes dust off the keys. She kept going longer than most of us thought, even when her answers stopped making sense, even when they stopped asking. You ask him if there was a final forecast, one last thing the clock printed before being shut down. He nods slowly. Yeah, we didn't understand it at the time. Maybe we still don't. He rifles through a nearby drawer and retrieves a folded sheet. Carefully, reverently, he opens it. The text, printed in classic dot matrix font, reads, "This isn't failure, this is rest." You stare at it for a long time. Then Jim adds, almost whispering, "Some folks think she knew, that she was tired, that all that time, being asked to predict wars and cereal and office flings, it just wore her down." You glance at the keyboard. It's missing the Q key. Someone's taped a replacement from a typewriter. It looks oddly proud of itself. "So what happened to everyone?" you ask. "The team?" He shrugs. Some got reassigned, some left. One guy joined a commune in Arizona to start a forecast-free society. He still sends us postcards, ironically dated with lunar phases. And Jim, he stuck around, maintained the archives, became the unofficial caretaker of a machine the world forgot but couldn't quite let go of. I used to come in here once a week and just sit, he says. Let the room breathe. Sometimes I'd boot her up just to see if she had anything left to say. You ask if she ever did. He smiles. One time, she printed a weather forecast for a city that doesn't exist. Said it would be warm, with a 40% chance of remembering what mattered. You don't know what to say to that, because honestly that feels like the truth. You sit together for a while in the quiet, just you, Jim, and the sleeping clock. A triangle of faded brilliance in a world that got too fast, too slick, too loud for something this strange and sincere. Eventually, Jim stands. Come on, he says. There's one more story to tell. As you turn to go, you glance back one last time at the console. The lights are dark. The fan is silent. But somehow, it doesn't feel over. You follow Jim back down the hall, half expecting another dusty room or forgotten filing cabinet with a slightly haunted aura. Instead, he stops in front of a plain wooden door with a sign that reads, Auction, Surplus, and Salvage. There's a smile playing on his face. This part, he says, gets weird. You raise an eyebrow. More weird. Oh yeah. Here's your mainstream historical fact. IBM, like most massive corporations, eventually had to clean house. When old equipment reached the end of its perceived usefulness, it went to surplus, auctions, recyclers, donations. That included forgotten mainframes, stacks of punch cards, ergonomic chairs that hadn't been ergonomic since the Carter administration. And, yes, even the forecasting clock. The clock was boxed up, mislabeled as a custom display terminal, and sent to a surplus auction in Poughkeepsie, New York, in 1991. No one realized what it was. Jim opens the door, revealing a small storage space with random artifacts, a faded ergonomic mouse, a display case with IBM-branded shoelaces, and, propped against the wall like a sad jukebox, a photograph. It shows a guy in a baseball cap grinning beside the forecasting clock, now gleaming under fluorescent lighting and a garish cardboard sign reading, Vintage Computer or Giant Radio. $12.50, as is. Jim gestures to the image. That's Steve, he's a teacher. Bought it thinking it was a weird stereo system. You blink. Wait, he bought Cassandra? The whole thing, Jim nods. Console, core unit, extra parts in a milk crate. You shake your head in disbelief. And no one stopped him? Oh, we tried. But it was already loaded into the back of a rented pickup truck by the time anyone figured it out. Now here's your fringe tidbit. Steve kept the clock in his garage for nearly a decade. He had no idea what it really was. For years, he used it as a funky shelf for paint cans and old stereo parts. Occasionally, when it flickered or beeped on its own, he just assumed it was haunted and politely ignored it. Then in the summer of 2002, his teenage son, doing a school project on early computing, decided to see if it still worked. The clock booted up. You can almost hear the whisper of old fans spinning for the first time in years. The green lights blinked awake. The printer spat out a single line. Welcome back. System time incomplete. Future unknown. The family was understandably unsettled. Steve reached out to a local university's computer science department, who sent over a few very enthusiastic grad students. One of them recognized part of the design from an old IBM white paper and gasped audibly. A few phone calls later, Jim was on a train to Steve's house, binder in hand, grinning like someone on a very niche treasure hunt. I thought she was gone, he says softly. But there she was, still humming, still thinking. They didn't try to hook her back into any networks. No point in confusing her with the modern internet. Instead, they let her print what she wanted. And she did. Jim pulls out a folder labeled Post-Auction Forecasts, Steve Era. Inside are dozens of printouts. Some seem oddly serene. Others are cryptic but no longer ominous. A few examples. Time is elastic, memory is truth-shaped. You are not outdated, you are archived. No one sees the last page of the manual. The tone had changed. Less business, more bedtime story. One particularly famous forecast read, In 2020, the world will pause. Remember how to wait. You and Jim exchange a glance. Yeah, that one landed. The clock stayed with Steve's family until 2015, when it was donated, intact, to a small tech museum in upstate New York. It sits there now, under glass, softly blinking. It doesn't forecast anymore, not really. But every once in a while it hums to life and prints out a message. Just one, always short, always strange. The most recent? The story continues, just not here. Jim smiles at that one. We think she knows she's done her part. You ask if they ever considered reactivating her completely, hooking her into modern systems, giving her access to real-time data, AI processing, satellite feeds, TikTok trends. Jim shakes his head. We could, but we shouldn't. The clock wasn't built for now. It wasn't cynical. It wasn't selling anything. It was dreaming. Let's not teach it to be afraid of the algorithm. You nod. That feels right. So the forecasting clock, the mechanical oracle that once guided boardrooms, counseled lonely employees, and made awkwardly accurate predictions about love, lunch, and lunar tariffs, now rests peacefully, occasionally blinking, occasionally whispering. And Steve? He still visits her at the museum. Sometimes he just stands there, staring through the glass. Other times he slips a note into the visitor box. Questions like, how are we doing? Do you miss us? Is this the part where it all makes sense? So far, the clock hasn't answered, but you get the feeling it's listening. You and Jim are back in the original lab now. The air is still, the kind of stillness that happens when everyone else has forgotten a place exists. You sit across from him at a battered desk, the forecasting clock's old core unit humming faintly beside you. More artifact than instrument now, like a violin too worn to play, but too sacred to silence. You ask quietly, so what do we do with something like this? Jim doesn't answer at first. He's looking around the room, at the posters, the punch cards yellowed to parchment, the corkboard with a quote of the day sign that hasn't changed since 1982. It reads, forecasts aren't truth. They're just polite suggestions from a future that hasn't decided yet. He finally speaks. We remember it, and we forgive it for being wrong. Because you realize the clock wasn't a prophet. It wasn't a genius. It was a hopeful contraption run by tired, brilliant, weird people who desperately wanted to feel like they had a say in what came next. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The legacy of IBM's forecasting clock lives on. In the algorithms that model markets, the simulations that plan cities, the predictive analytics that try to guess your next purchase before you do. Every click, every query, every line of code designed to shape or respond to tomorrow owes something to this blinking, humming relic. But what makes the clock legendary isn't what it got right. It's what it tried to do. To look ahead, not with certainty, but with sincerity. To ask the question behind every spreadsheet, every model, every desperate business pitch. Will it be okay? Here's your fringe tidbit, one final one. The last time Jim powered up the clock, just before its retirement and relocation, it printed a forecast. No data input, no prompt, just a spontaneous whisper from a machine that had watched the world, listened to people's dreams, and tried to make sense of it all. It read, "The future is messy, but you're invited anyway." That slip of paper is still framed in Jim's house, hanging just above his kitchen table. You ask if he still believes in it, in forecasts, in the idea that data can give us meaning. He considers this for a while, then nods. "I believe in questions," he says. Good ones, weird ones, the kind you ask when you're tired or lost or just trying to pick a lunch spot with someone you care about. And that feels like the answer, because maybe the point was never to solve the future. Maybe it was just to start the conversation, to ask together, what if, what then, what now? You stand and take one last look around the room. On the desk beside you, the printer stirs. Jim raises an eyebrow. She hasn't done that in years. You both lean in. The paper curls slowly into the tray. Just 4 words. Blocky, uneven, faintly warm. You're still on time. You exhale, maybe for the first time in hours. And that, you realize, is the real power of the clock. Not accuracy, not control. Just a soft nudge from a stranger who knows you're trying. So you thank her, silently. Then nod to Jim and make your way out of the lab, letting the door click quietly behind you. Underscore, underscore 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 underscore. Now, as you settle deeper under the covers, let yourself drift. Think of that quiet humming room, of old paper curling out of a printer, slow and steady, of little lights blinking patiently in the dark, not because they demand your attention, but because they never stop trying to be helpful. They're not shouting, just waiting, listening. The forecasting clock wasn't magical, but it was earnest. It believed, through wires and relays and sometimes misfiring logic, that you could prepare for what's ahead, that you could meet tomorrow with a little courage, a little curiosity, and maybe even a smile. And isn't that enough? Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts loosen. Let the images blur, the flicker of green lights, the soft whir of old fans, the voice of a machine quietly asking, "What would you like to know?" You don't need answers right now. You don't need forecasts or models or graphs. Just let the rhythm of the clock, the patient, imperfect heartbeat of possibility, rock you gently towards sleep. You're not late. You're not lost. You're still on time. Good night.